Good afternoon, class. Today we shall be discussing classification of armed conflict under international humanitarian law, and the lecture will be presented by Professor Akpobome Teresa Uzamaka. So let's start by defining armed conflict. What is armed conflict under international humanitarian law? So IHA defines armed conflict as a situation where there is resort to armed violence or armed force between states, or protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organized armed groups, or between such groups within a state. Listening to this definition, it will just come to your mind that there are two categories of armed conflict. So what are these categories of armed conflict? Like I said earlier, there are two main categories of armed conflict under international humanitarian law. The first is international armed conflict, and this is an armed conflict that occurs between two or more states, characterized by the use of armed force or armed violence between their armed forces. An example of an international armed conflict will be the Ukraine-Russia conflict that is currently ongoing. Now, the second type of armed conflict is known as non-international armed conflict or internal armed conflict. This type of armed conflict takes place within the boundaries of a single state, involving the government's armed force or armed forces and one or more organized non-state armed groups, or between such organized non-state armed groups themselves. If you look at Nigeria currently, there is an armed conflict going on between the Boko Haram insurgents and the Nigerian army. Again, look at Israel and Hamas. That is a typical example of a non-international armed conflict, and it occurs within the territory of a state. Okay, so concluding, we would say that understanding the classification of armed conflict under IHL is very essential. Why is it essential? Because it helps us to ensure that we comply with international legal standards, also to protect the rights of individuals affected by the conflict, and then in promotion of peace and stability worldwide. There is no way we can know the right laws to apply in times of armed conflict if we do not understand the particular types of armed conflict that is involved. So I hope we'll be able to remember what we have said today about armed conflict and the categories of armed conflict under international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.